The sky stretched wide and pale over the town, the kind of morning light that seemed to flatten everything into silence. A horse-drawn coach rolled in on the uneven track, its wheels shuddering against the ruts of dust and gravel. No one paid much attention to it at first. Coaches came often enough, bringing goods, letters, and sometimes strangers. But for one man waiting at the edge of the street, the moment carried a weight that seemed to press against his chest. His name was Samuel Hart, a rancher with callous hands and a face carved into weariness by years of war and solitude. He had been promised a bride, someone who might help him rebuild the life he had lost, and the arrival of that coach was supposed to mark the beginning of something steadier than the hollow days he had endured. When the door of the coach creaked open, his heart leapt, though he tried not to let it show. A figure emerged, small and hesitant, stepping down onto the dusty street with a bundle clutched against her chest. She was younger than he had expected, her frame delicate but her eyes alert, as though searching the horizon for escape. Her clothing was plain, travel-worn, and she carried nothing but that bundle, which he could now see was tied with a faded silk ribbon, its color once bright but now dulled by distance. This was not the woman he had been told would come. His letter from across the ocean had described her older sister, a woman closer to his own age, practical, perhaps even stern. Instead, standing before him was someone else entirely, her younger sister, Mai, sent in her place without explanation. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had been cheated before, by traders, by promises of peace that never lasted, by his own heart that once believed in permanence. The sting of disappointment flickered across his features, though he fought to keep it buried. The girl bowed slightly, uncertain, her movements carrying the careful reserve of someone taught that silence was safer than speech. She lifted her head, and in her dark eyes he saw both fear and an unspoken plea. She was not the woman he had been expecting, but she was here, and the contract had already been sealed somewhere oceans away. For Mai, the town felt like a barren stage where every stair cut into her skin. She had been told her duty was to step into her sister's place, that honor demanded sacrifice, that a family's survival sometimes meant offering up its youngest to an unknown fate. Her parents had pressed a ribbon into her hands before she left, whispering that it would remind her of home when the silence grew unbearable. She carried it now as though it were a lifeline. As she stood before the stranger who was meant to be her husband, she felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. He looked older, harsher than she had imagined. His clothing was rugged, worn with use, and there was a stiffness in his stance that spoke of battle fought not only on battlefields but within himself. She did not know if he would send her back or accept her, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. They exchanged no words at first. The clamor of the street, the voices of merchants and townsfolk, filled the air, but between them stretched a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow sound. Samuel wanted to demand why she had come instead of the sister he had been promised, but he also recognized the futility of such questions. The girl's presence meant the choice had been made elsewhere, in households bound by poverty or desperation. His disappointment wrestled with something else, something quieter but no less insistent, a sense of obligation, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of compassion for a girl who looked as though the world might crush her at any moment. He gestured for her to follow, his voice low and flat when he finally spoke. "Come." She clutched her bundle tighter and obeyed, trailing behind him as they left the bustle of town and headed toward the open land. The road stretched long and lonely, the horizon blurring with distance. She walked carefully, measuring each step, as though the earth might betray her if she moved too quickly. He glanced at her from time to time, noting how the wind pulled strands of her hair loose, how she kept her gaze lowered, how she seemed to shrink from the vastness around them. She was far from the crowded lanes of her village, and the emptiness of the plains must have felt like another world. The ranch came into view hours later, a modest spread of land fenced against the wild. The house was sturdy but bore the marks of neglect, as though its owner had cared little for the details of comfort. The barn leaned slightly, weathered by storms, and the corral stood empty save for a few restless horses. This was the world she was stepping into, not by choice but by decree. Samuel dismounted and tied his horse, then waited as she stood uncertainly at the gate. He opened it and motioned her inside. She obeyed again, though every instinct urged her to hold back. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and dust. It was clean enough, but bare, its walls stripped of warmth or decoration. He set her bundle on a table and studied her in the dim light. Finally, the word broke free, rougher than he intended. You're not the one I was told would come." She flinched, then bowed her head. "Sister, sick. I come instead." Her English was halting, the words clipped, but the meaning was clear. He pressed a hand to his brow, exhaling through his teeth. He could send her away, he thought. He could write to the agency, demand they honor their contract. But the image of her standing alone in the street returned to him, fragile yet stubbornly upright, and he felt the old conflict rise, the part of him that longed for order against the part that knew abandonment too well. As dusk fell, the air shifted. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the first distant roll of thunder rattled the sky. Samuel moved to secure the animals, and my, uncertain but determined to be useful, followed his motions. The storm descended quickly, wind whipping across the plains, rain lashing against the house and sheets. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her frightened face as she pressed against the wall for shelter. Without thinking, he drew her inside, shutting the door against the gale. The house shook, and the noise of the storm drowned all thought. In the flickering light of the fire, she huddled near him, clutching her ribbon tightly. He saw her lips moving in silent prayer, words in a language he did not understand, and something in her vulnerability stirred him more than he expected. The night stretched on, long and restless. The storm refused to relent, battering the walls until it seemed the house itself might give way. Samuel sat watchful, his rifle within reach though there was no enemy but the sky. Mai drifted between wakefulness and sleep, her head nodding, then jerking up at each crash of thunder. Once, when a particularly violent gust rattled the shutters, she startled and grasped his arm without thinking. He stiffened, then slowly allowed her grip to remain. Her hand was small, trembling, but the contact held a warmth that seeped into him despite his efforts to resist it. When the storm finally broke toward dawn, silence returned in fragments, the dripping of rain from the eaves, the distant rumble retreating across the plains. Mai stowed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and whispered words he barely caught. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, uncertain, but sincere. He studied her, and for the first time since she arrived, he saw not a mistake or a deception but a person caught in the snare of fate, much like himself. He did not reply, only nodded, but something in his chest eased, just slightly. The sun rose over a battered world, the land glistening with rain, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Samuel stepped outside to assess the damage, and she followed, her steps tentative but steady. Together they surveyed the fences, the barn, the land that would demand their labor. Neither spoke of the storm or of the unspoken distance still between them, but the silence had changed. It no longer pressed with hostility. It carried the weight of survival, of two strangers bound not by choice but by necessity. And though Samuel still wondered if he could trust this new power force upon him, he found himself unwilling to send her away. The choice had not been his, nor Hayes, but now the consequences belonged to both. The storm had passed, but the questions lingered, and in that fragile dawn they stood side by side, uncertain the road ahead yet tethered to it together. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the kind of light that seemed to wash everything clean while leaving behind the smell of soaked earth and broken branches. Samuel moved quietly about the yard, repairing a section of fence that had splintered under the wind's assault. His movements were steady, deliberate, but his mind drifted toward the figure watching him from the porch. Mai stood with her hands folded tightly around the ribbon she carried, her face pale but her eyes focused, as though she was studying every motion, every decision he made. She wanted to help. He could see it in the way she shifted her weight forward, ready to step down from the porch, but hesitation bound her in place. She did not know what tasks were Hayes, what boundaries existed in the strange life she had been thrust into. Samuel glanced at her once, then twice, and finally gestured toward the broken rails. "If you're going to stand there, you might as well hold these." He carried the planks to her and set them down with a thud. She blinked, then bent to lift one. The wood was heavier than she expected, and she nearly dropped it, but she bit her lip and steadied herself. Her thin frame betrayed her struggle, yet she refused to let it fall. Samuel's brows lifted, not in mockery but in a quiet respect that he would not voice. She followed him to the fence, watching closely as he set the plank, hammered the nails, and tightened the wire. When he handed her a nail, she pressed it into place with trembling fingers. The first strike of the hammer missed, glancing against the wood, and the sound startled her, but she tried again until it sank true. The day wore on with such small exchanges. He showed her where the water bucket hung, how to check the latch on the barn door, how to scatter feed for the chickens. At first she moved with uncertainty, but repetition bred a rhythm, and he noted how quickly she adapted. There was no complaint, no collapse into despair, only a quiet persistence. By evening she was carrying water from a well, her steps careful but steady, the sun painting her figure in long shadows across the ground. Samuel watched from the barn doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and found himself surprised by the faint stir of something like pride. The neighbors, however, were not so charitable. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the town, carried on the sharp tongues of men who distrusted anything unfamiliar. Samuel rode in for supplies a few days later, and the air felt different as he dismounted outside the general store. Two men leaned against the hitching rail, their eyes narrowing as they caught sight of him. "Heard you got yourself one of the male brides," one said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Only it ain't the one you ordered, is it?" The other chuckled, spitting into the date. Samuel ignored them, stepping into the store, but the words clung to him. When he returned outside with flour and coffee strapped to his horse, the men hadn't moved. "Best send her back," one muttered. "Town don't take kindly to strangers, especially ones from across the ocean." Samuel met their gaze, his own expression flat as stone. "She stays," he said simply, and mounted without another word. When he returned home, I noticed a stiffness in his shoulders, the way he set the supplies down harder than necessary. She asked no questions, but later, while they worked side by side in silence, she reached for the sack of flour he had carried, lifted it from the table, and placed it carefully into the pantry. A small gesture, but her eyes met his, and for an instant he felt the edge of his anger soften. Winter crept closer, the air thinning and biting hard each morning. Samuel taught her to split kindling, to stack wood so it dried properly, to patch the chinks in the barn walls. At first the axe handle felt alien in her hands, but she learned where to strike, listening to the rhythm of his instructions until the log split clean. He said little, but when she managed to cut that cleave the wood in one motion, he nodded once, and she carried that acknowledgment like a rare treasure. Nights grew colder, the fire a constant companion. They ate in near silence, but the silence shifted, no longer empty. It carried the weight of shared survival. It was during one of those nights, when the fire crackled low, that the howl of wolves echoed across the plain. Mai froze, her bowl halfway to her lips, the sound foreign and chilling. Samuel stood, rifle in hand, his body taut with awareness. The howls came closer, circling, until the horses in the corral whinnied in fear. Samuel moved quickly, loading the rifle, stepping onto the porch with grim focus. Mai followed, clutching the doorframe, her breath quick. Shadows moved beyond the fence, eyes glinting in the dark. The first wolf darted forward, testing the barrier, teeth bared. Samuel fired, the crack tearing through the night, and the animal yelped before vanishing into the dark. But more remained, their growls vibrating through the air. Then, without warning, another figure emerged from the dark, not an animal but a man. Tall, lean, dressed in the leathers of a people the settlers spoke with equal parts fear and scorn. A native warrior, silent as the shadows he seemed command, stepped between the wolves and the corral. In his hand was a bow, the arrow loose so swiftly I barely saw the motion before it struck true. Another wolf yelped and collapsed, and the rest scattered, retreating into the night. Samuel lowered his rifle, uncertain, suspicion flashing in his eyes. Mai, however, looked at the stranger with something closer to awe. The warrior did not speak at first. He simply glanced at Samuel, then at Mai, then at the land itself, as though weighing what kind of people stood before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady. "Wolves will return. Fence is weak." Samuel bristled at the intrusion, his pride rising to meet the challenge, but Mai stepped forward, bowing her head in gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words careful but clear. The warrior studied her, something unreadable passing through his gaze, then disappeared into the dark as silently as he had arrived. For days afterward, Mai thought of him. Samuel pretended not to, but he tightened the fences and set traps, his mind restless. When the warrior appeared again, it was without fanfare, as though he had been there all along. He showed me how to track small animals in the snow, how to read the signs of weather in the sky. Samuel remained distant, wary, but he did not drive him off. There was something about the quiet way the man moved, the unspoken strength he carried, that even Samuel could not dismiss. Meanwhile, tensions in town simmered hotter. Whispers turned to open hostility, men muttering in Samuel's hearing that he was betraying his own kind, that his ranch would bring trouble down on them all. One evening, returning from a mercantile, he found a crude message carved into his barn door. Send her back. He stood there for a long time, fists clenched, before wiping the words away with his knife. He said nothing to Mai, but the next morning she found him working before dawn, reinforcing the gates as though expecting siege. Yet amid the hostility, a fragile intimacy began to take root between them. One night, as snow fell thick outside, Mai sat by the fire with a ribbon in her hands. Samuel watched, curious despite himself. She noticed his gaze and lifted the ribbon slightly. "Home," she said softly. "Family." He nodded, then pointed to the scar that cut across his arm, a relic of the war he rarely spoke of. "Past," he said simply. Their words were few, but they carried weight, and when she laughed softly at his attempt to mimic the tones of a language, he found himself laughing too, a sound he had not heard from his own throat in years. Days turned into weeks, and though the challenges mounted, their rhythm deepened. She learned his habits, the way he drank his coffee black, the way he walked the perimeter each morning without fail. He learned Hayes, how she hummed softly when she worked, how she kept her ribbon close even when her hands were rough with chores. Slowly, trust seeped into the cracks of their silence. But the world beyond their walls did not rest. One afternoon, riders approached the ranch. For men from town, their expressions hard. Samuel stepped outside to meet them, rifle resting casually in his hands, though his body was taut with readiness. "We've come to give you fair warning," one of them said. "This girl don't belong here. Folks are saying you're bringing trouble down on all of us." Samuel's gaze did not falter. "She stays," he replied. "You want to make it your concern. Then make it." The men shifted uneasily, sensing the steel beneath his calm. After a tense silence, they rode off, but their threat hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. That night, Mai sat by the fire, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had overheard enough to know what was coming. Samuel glanced at her, so the fear she tried to hide, and for the first time, he reached across the small distance between them and set his hand gently over Hayes. She startled, then looked up, her eyes wide. "You're not who I expected," he said quietly. "But maybe you're who I needed." Her breath caught, and in that fragile moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, replaced by something tender, uncertain, but undeniably real. Dawn crept over the horizon with a quiet that felt deceptive, the pale light gilding the frost-covered fields in a fragile beauty that could not hide the tension running beneath it. Samuel stood at the edge of the porch, rifle resting loosely in his hand, his eyes scanning the empty stretch of land that led toward town. He had not slept. The warning left carved into his barn door still burned in his mind, and though the riders had not returned since their last visit, he felt the weight of their promise pressing closer with each passing day. Inside the house, Mai moved softly, her presence steady and deliberate. She set water to boil, her motions calm, though she too felt the unease in the air. Every sound outside made her pause. Every creak of the board beneath her feet reminded her of the fragile walls that separated them from the hostility beyond. When the horses came, she heard them first. The faint thud of hooves carried through the morning stillness, distant but growing nearer. Samuel's jaw tightened. He raised a rifle, not to fire but to make clear that he would not be taken unprepared. Mai stepped to the doorway, her ribbon clutched in her hand, and looked past him into the distance. A line of riders approached. More than before, their figures stark against the pale light. Samuel counted at least 10. The odds were not in his favor, and he knew it, but retreat was not an option. By the time the riders reached the fence line, Samuel was already outside, his boots crunching over the frost. The men dismounted, spreading in a semicircle, their expressions grim. The one who had spoken before stepped forward again. "We warned you," he said. "This girl brings nothing but trouble. You send her back, or we'll see to it ourselves." Samuel stood tall, rifle held steady. His voice carried no hesitation. She stays. Tension snapped taut, and for a moment it seemed violence might erupt immediately. But the leader raised a hand, signaling restraint. Think carefully. Hot. You're outnumbered. No one in this town will stand with you if you keep defying us. You'll lose everything. Samuel's eyes flicked briefly toward Mai, who stood just inside the doorway, her face pale but resolute. He turned back to the men, his voice low and unyielding. I've already lost everything that ever mattered once. I won't do it again. The standoff broke with a suddenness that left no room for thought. One of the men swung his rifle upward, and Samuel fired before the barrel cleared. Chaos erupted. Gunfire. Shouts. The thunder of boots as men scattered and charged. Mai ducked low, heart pounding, her breath catching as she saw Samuel firing, reloading, moving with the grim precision of a man who had lived through war. Bullets splintered wood around her, and the air filled with smoke. The horses screamed, rearing in panic, adding to the cacophony. From the tree line beyond the ranch, another figure moved swiftly into the fray. The native warrior, silent and fierce, loosed arrows with deadly accuracy, cutting down attackers who sought to flank Samuel. Mai's eyes widened with recognition, her fear momentarily tempered by relief. The warrior fought like a shadow, his movements fluid, each strike deliberate. Samuel, though hardened by conflict, felt the weight of gratitude for the unexpected ally, though he gave no time to speak it. The battle raged in bursts, surges of gunfire followed by tense lulls. Mai did not hide completely. When Samuel staggered with a graze to his arm, she rushed to his side, pulling him back behind cover, pressing a scarf against the wound to staunch the bleeding. Stay low, he barked, but she shook her head fiercely, her trembling hands refusing to let go. No leave, she whispered. Not now. Her words cut through the chaos more sharply than any bullet, and for a moment he saw her not as a frightened girl who had stepped from the coach weeks ago, but as someone forged by necessity, determined to stand against the storm that threatened them. The attackers pressed harder, circling, trying to force their way into the house. Mai darted to the door, throwing the bolt, then grabbed a small knife from the table. Her hands shook, but she held it tightly, ready to defend even if it meant nothing against rifles. Samuel caught sight of her stance, her defiance, and something shifted inside him. She was no longer a burden thrust upon him by chance. She was a partner, chosen not by contract, but by the courage she revealed in the crucible of danger. The warrior's arrows dwindled, and he moved closer, joining Samuel in the yard. Together they covered each other, the unspoken rhythm of trust growing with each exchanged glance. At one point Samuel's rifle jammed, and before panic could set in, the warrior's blade flashed, cutting down the man who had rushed forward. Samuel nodded once, acknowledgment given in silence. The fight dragged into the afternoon, the sun climbing high, each side blooded but unbroken. Finally, the settlers faltered, retreating under combined resistance they had underestimated. They left behind 2 of their own dead, their bodies stark against the trampled earth. The rest mounted and rode hard, but not without casting looks that promised this was not the end. When the last echo of hooves faded, silence fell heavy over the ranch. Samuel lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, his arm bleeding more freely now. Mai rushed to him, guiding him inside, forcing him to sit while she worked. Her hands were steady despite the terror that still thrummed through her veins. She tore cloth into strips, bound as wound, her lips pressed into a line of determination. He winced, but did not protest. When she finally tied the bandage, she looked up, her eyes shining not with fear but with resolve. I stay, she said firmly, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it. Even danger. I stay. He stared at her, words caught in his throat. The warrior stood at the doorway, silent as ever, watching. For a long moment none of them spoke, the weight of what had happened settling like dust. Samuel finally broke the silence, his voice rough. They won't stop. They'll come again. Mai met his gaze, unwavering. Then we face. That night the ranch bore the scars of battle. The barn door hung splintered, fences shattered, blood staining the frozen ground. But inside the house, the fire burned steady, casting warm light over faces drawn tight with exhaustion but bound by something stronger than fear. Samuel sat with Mai beside him, her ribbon draped across her lap, its faded silk a fragile tether to the family she had left behind. He reached out, fingers brushing the ribbon, then resting over her hand. "I didn't choose this," he admitted softly. "But I choose you. I'll choose you forever." The words were raw, stripped of any pretense, and into my heard not a vow of possession but a recognition of her worth, her place at his side by choice rather than duty. The warrior rose quietly, stepping toward the door. Samuel looked up, meeting his gaze. "Why help us?" he asked. The man's eyes flickered, dark and unreadable. "Because you stood when others turned away," he said simply, and left without another word, disappearing into the night as though he belonged more to the land than to men. The days that followed were uneasy. Word spread quickly of the fight, and though some in town muttered that Samuel had gone too far, others spoke in hushed tones of his defiance, of the unlikely alliance that had turned the tide. Still, the threat lingered, a shadow that promised further trials. Yet for Samuel and something had shifted irrevocably. No longer strangers bound by a contract neither had chosen. They had faced death together and emerged with a bond that could not be broken by fear or prejudice. As winter deepened, survival demanded their focus, repairing what was broken, storing food, keeping the fire alive. Each day carried its burdens, but within the rhythm of labor grew a quiet companionship. Samuel began to see not just her resilience but her laughter, rare but genuine, her curiosity about the land, her courage in moments small and large. In turn, so passed the stern exterior to the man who had lost but still endured, who carried scars yet found room to protect her. Yet beneath the fragile peace lay the knowledge that the world beyond their walls had not changed. Danger would return, perhaps in greater force, perhaps in subtler ways, but return it would. For now, though, as snow fell thick over the plains, blanketing the scars of battle, they allowed themselves a moment of rest, a moment where choice, however costly, felt like defiance against the cruelty of fate. Samuel sat by the fire, beside him, their silence companionable rather than strained. Outside, the land lay hushed under the weight of winter. Inside, in the flicker of light, he whispered again, softer this time but no less certain. "Forever." Mai's eyes closed briefly, a tear slipping free, not of sorrow but of release. She leaned against him, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt not like a pawn traded between worlds but like someone who had found her place in one.